Hello, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In a previous video,
Previously on the Crates Motel,
I made a video showing how I process kick drums in the MPC. I had quite a few requests to do the same for snare drums, so I'm going to do that today. I'm going to run through some of the processing that I do in the MPC. Not definitive, just some of the processing that I do in the MPC on snare drums, and I'll be providing an effects chain which you can download and use yourself in your MPC. Let's jump in. So what I've done is I've taken four very, very well-known snare drums. The reason why I've done this is because you're most likely going to be familiar with them, so you'll get a bit more of a grasp of what I'm doing in the processing. There's so many different snare drums. I could take random snare drums from all over the place and it wouldn't be so clear. With these four particular snare drums, almost all of you are going to know them. Apache, Funky Drummer, Impeach the President, Call Is Back, Funk Inc. Very, very obvious, classic snare drums, not just in boom bap, but multiple genres. So what I tend to do, I'm going to provide you with an effects chain, which you can download and use on your snare drums. Like I said, it's not a definitive, this isn't a definitive video on how to EQ snare drums, because every single snare drum is different. Don't do anything by default. And as I've said before, if somebody tells you that this is the ultimate way, the only way to EQ and compress snare drums or process snare drums, then walk in the opposite direction, because there is no ultimate way. There are rules or guidelines rather that you can follow that will help you, but don't copy the numbers. So the effects chain I'm going to provide will give you a good starting point to process your snare drums. But what I also do is I do a little bit of surgical EQ at pad level. The effects chain I'm going to give you would be, you can have it at pad level if you want, but it's more aimed at kind of track level. So if you've got a couple of snare drums or you want to group your snare drums or low perk together. But as I said, I do a bit of processing at pad level. So that tends to just be surgical EQ. Or any kind of surgical work I might do at pad level, some envelope work, maybe some sample editing work. But in terms of effects, I tend to just use EQ, and it really is just surgical. So I'm not looking to boost anything here because I don't want to then have to process that boosted EQ. But again, there's no rules. If you want to boost it here, feel free. But I tend to just attenuate, and it's just surgical. So let's just... Yeah, we've got power EQ in each one of those. So we'll start with Apache. And what I want to do with a snare drum in terms of surgical work is I want to get rid of some of the low end and just get rid of what I don't need. So maybe some of the highs, maybe possibly some of the snap and clarity. It might be a little bit, there might be some room noise in there. There might be some vinyl noise in there. So anything like that, noise reduction work, what you would call audio restoration, I guess. And also getting rid of the low end, like I said. But you don't want to roll it off too much because you don't want to lose the body of the snare drum. There's a nice, on a lot of snare drums, there's a nice area of body. And I'll show you what I mean when I get rid of the body in a second. Excuse me. So you don't want to lose that. You can just use filters here. See, if I roll it too high, it starts sounding brittle and just not really very nice. But if I take it down too low, you can start hearing kind of the low end of the room coming in. Obviously, this was taken off the Incredible Bongo Band, and there's lots of bongos and congas going on around it as well. So they would have also have created some mud and some room sound, some reverb. So what I'm essentially doing there is actually cutting out some of the conga reverb and bongo reverb. So that's all you really, really need to do surgically most of the time. With Funky Drummer, I actually quite like some of the low end in there. So again, you have to use your ears. Don't just copy the numbers and say, oh, I saw Conan take it up to 240 hertz. I'll do that in every single snare drum, because that's not going to work for every single snare drum. You know, and obviously sometimes as well, the snare drum and the kick drum will sit with each other. So you've got a bit of low end from the kick, but sometimes they won't. So you don't always want to get rid of all the low end in your snare drums. So it's a judgment thing. It's subjective. It's how you feel. It's what you're hearing. It's how they sit in context with other sounds. So like I said, please don't just copy the numbers. Look at what I'm doing and more kind of think about the reasons behind me doing it. So like I said, a lot of the time you want to roll off some of the low end on snare drums to get rid of room noise and some of the sizzle sometimes in the top because you get rattle from snare drums. So sometimes you want to get rid of some of the highs and some of the mids sometimes even. I think the reason why Funky Drummer is such a used snare drum is because it's pretty damn perfect without any processing on it at all. Anyway, let's listen to Impeach. Now Impeach could probably do with some highs when I actually start processing it. Possibly. Again, I can hear a little bit of room noise in there. But I can get rid of that with Transient Design or by editing the sample. But I kind of like a little bit of a tail on it. So I've just rolled off some of the lows, and that's all I need to do with that. Cool is back. Very, very reverby drum beat. But again, I want to leave some of the body in there. So to me, already you've done quite a lot of work just by doing a bit of restoration or getting rid of some of the room noise or getting rid of some of the low end. And that's at pad level, like I said. So now if we go into track level, obviously now this effects chain, which I've got here, is going to be affecting all of the snare drums. So I'm going to have to play around a little bit if I'm going to be individually EQing them. You can have this at pad level, like I said, if you want. But for some reason, I've just kind of got into the habit of doing a bit of surgical work at pad level. And then I tend to process my snares or low perk together, either on a submix or on a track. I have them all on the same track. It's entirely up to you. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's whatever suits your workflow. As you know, if you've watched my videos, you'll know that I've done templates and you can have like a low perk on the submix and just mix your low perk and process them together, and you could use this chain on that. I'm using it at track level here. So to start with, very, very similar to the kick drums, I've got Transient. Sound design. Another reason why I chose these snare drums is because quite a lot of them, especially that one, have got quite a lot of tail to them. So I wanted to show what you can do with Transient Design. And obviously with attack, as you know, you can round off the transient at the start, as you can hear there, or you can really add some click to it. To be honest, personally, all of those snare drums have got nice transient, nice attack, so I wouldn't do much with attack there. But sustain, if you listen to, for instance, Cool is Back, and I'm just rolling off the tail basically, or affecting the sustain of the snare drum. So that could be really useful in sound design. Sounds nice on the Impeach snare drum. So it makes it sound really, really tight. Sounds really nice on Funky Drummer as well. I recognise that kind of very short Funky Drummer snare from some of the stuff by people like Mantronic, from the mid to late 80s. Todd Terry also did that quite a lot. And just maybe a bit more subtle on the Apache one, because I kind of like that reverb on Apache. So that's something that you can do with snare. So I have transient at the start, so I can affect the initial transient, give it a bit more bite if I want to, or a bit more of a hit, and then obviously the sustain. I would say, me personally, sustain is probably the one that I use the most on kicks and snares. And if you've watched my kick video, you'll know that. So if we move on now to compressor. That's the next one in the chain. It's the same as the kick drum. In fact, this effects chain is pretty much the same as the kick drum one. It's a good starting point for most drum sounds, to be honest. Hi-hats may be a little bit different. So again here, this is the default on Akai. I kind of left this on purpose just so you could see how completely ridiculous it is. I mean, who's going to start off at, it was at 48 minus 48 dB? What's the point? And why would you have plus 15 on the output? Anyway. This is where I would have my default, and I have actually got a default of this. And when you download this effects chain, that will be your default. So, obviously we want to turn that on. So with compression on snare drums, it's really useful. Obviously, you're not having to necessarily reel it in and get them all the same level, because with programming, you can choose what the velocity is. If you're using live snare drums, this is going to be a different process. But today we're just going to we're working on the MPC. Generally, it's going to be programs. Maybe we've got an entire drum beat where we want to level things out. So that's a little bit different, but that'll be more covered by loops here. And here I'm doing one shots. So you would use compression to maybe introduce a bit of snap to your snare drums. The Impeach is going to be a good example here. So you want to let the transient through, so a longer attack, short release. Take that down a little bit. Bring that back up a little bit. Take that up a little bit. Probably take that a bit longer as well. Yeah, that's better. Maybe that back a little bit. You see, watch what I'm doing here. I'm shaping. So this is why I say don't copy numbers, especially on compression, because every single sound is going to be different. So you're kind of like shifting all these different controls together. This is why it's nice sometimes to have an actual physical compressor rather than having to do it with a mouse or on a GUI. But you're balancing all of those different controls up against each other. And this is why I get so frightened. Frightened, is that the right word? Miffed, perhaps. When I see people showing how to do compression on YouTube and they say, always have the attack here, always have the release here, or always have this ratio. What I prefer to do, and again, I'm not saying that the way that I'm doing it is 100% right, because there's multiple ways to do things. But how I've always done compression is almost closing my eyes and feeling. Obviously, I can't close my eyes with a GUI because I haven't got hands on. But feeling, balancing the attack against the release, against the ratio, and shaping the way that the sound is. Whether I want it to have a rounded initial attack, or whether I want it to have a sharp initial attack, whether I want it to be punchy by using the release, whether I want it compressed more hard knee, using the ratio, or using hard or soft knee compression. So it's about balancing. And then almost, and using the mix as well. Don't forget that you can blend some of the dry signal with some of the process signal. So use all of these controls to dial in the sound that you want. That's an overcompressed Impeach snare drum there. You can hear that I've brought up the room sound. So then I might want to go back, and I might want to add some sustain. Doesn't sound great, but you can see what I'm doing. So it's about balancing these against each other. Let's just come out of here and actually, no, I'll tell you what, we'll take that off there. So use the controls with each other. Don't think about just setting the attack, just setting the release, forgetting about it, just setting the ratio, forgetting about it. Use all of them with each other, in conjunction with each other. Balance them out together. That's how you're shaping your sound. And that is a good way of thinking of compression, is using it as a shaper, as a way of shaping the transient, the sustain, etc. So after compression, I would go with EQ. So I've used Transient to maybe shape, add some Transient, add some attacks, reduce some sustain. I've used Compression, again, another shaping tool for the snare drum. And then after I've compressed it, actually, let's go back and we'll leave Compression on. That's probably a little bit too much. Yeah, I want it compressed a little bit. I want you to hear it. So now we're going to be doing some more surgical work, because obviously now we've processed it, you can be introducing muddiness or top end or some more low end introduced again. So here, taking out a little bit of mud, I feel like that's probably about 15. Just cleaning it up, and let's just add a little bit of top to it. Mostly you'll be able to hear the mud being cut out. Look, I've overdone it, and I've overdone it on purpose because I want you to hear it. I would be a lot more subtle, to be honest, but I really wanted you to hear, you kind of hear like a woo, woo, woo. 200. That takes it out, maybe a little bit back. So I'm getting that woo, woo, woo. And that would literally be the sound of the sound waves reverberating inside the snare drum. So that's just cleaned it up. Like I said, I've overcooked it because I want you to hear the effect. And then, as you can see, we have the lovely default values from Akai. Let's go back to how it should be. Tube drive. Here you can do some really nice additional design. That's just crunching it up. Now obviously the processing I've done has not been on these 3 other snare drums. So what I've done with Impeach there is I've got rid of some of the low end, I've cleared up some of the mud, I've given it a little bit of crispiness, and I've basically made it sound a little bit more modern, I suppose would be the best way to describe it. But there's no right or wrong. The tube drive at the end is just adding a bit of bite. That's more subtle, I would say. So that was the original. And that is going to sit a lot nicer in if you're making a more modern track. It's just cleaner, crisper. So it's not going to be right for every single track, obviously. Sometimes you just want that classic Impeach the President. Let's just do a little bit more work on the transient, I think. Let's take a bit. So now that's really crispy. Let's just add a bit of attack as well. So you can hear that I've added a really nice bit of crispiness and a bit of attack at the start. So that's obviously using all 4 there. But please, I reiterate, I've overcooked it because I want you to hear. Sometimes I do get people say, but it's because I'm a mastering engineer first and foremost, probably. So my job is to make things sound better subtly. So quite often I've had people say, not necessarily a complaint, but just say, I can't perhaps hear the difference on YouTube, or can you just overcook it a little bit more so I can hear what you're doing? So that's what I've done here, is overcooked. That is a very modern sounding Impeach the President snare drum. Do you know what? I knew I was going to end up just processing the Impeach because, like Funky Drummer, it's almost a perfect snare drum. Even completely raw and unprocessed. Yeah, I probably wouldn't have that extra attack on there. It's just a bit clicky now. So, Impeach the President processed. So there you have it. just to summarize, I'm just looking at my MPC here so I can remember. Air transient, air compressor, air power EQ, air tube drive. All of them are kind of sound design. And then don't forget, at pad level, I also did some surgical EQ, just kind of really getting rid of the low end. Air transient, just to give you a bit of bite or to affect the sustain of the snare drum. Air compressor to add some snap, maybe balance it out if you're EQing a loop. Power EQ to add the flavor that you want to add to it, whether you want to boost the highs on it, whether you want to give it a little bit more low mids or high mids, some sizzle at the top. And then tube drive right at the end, as you know if you watch my videos, my favorite plugin on the MPC, just to add a little bit more character. Tube drive you could swap out for the vintage modes, the MPC 60 or the 3000 or the SP1200 one. So it's just personal, I'm not a fan of it. Or you could have Air Lo-Fi on there, or you could add, just any kind of character plugins. I leave the character until the end, and the reason for that is it can add some highs or some lows or some mids or whatever it's going to add. If you have it too early on in your chain, you're then going to be fighting with it with other compression, with EQ, etc. So adding the character at the end means you can get the sound design right, the EQ right, the compression right, the transient designing right, and then you add the character right at the end. That's why I always have a vintage mode at the end, or tube drive at the end, or not always the lo-fi plugins at the end, actually. You know, there is no rule, it does depend, but with something like drums or vocals, for instance, I quite often want to add the character right at the end, you know, kind of get that console sound or analog sound, anything like that, saturation. I tend to add that at the end so that I'm not fighting with it early on, having to change the EQ, having to change the compression, etc. So that's why I tend to have character plugins at the end of the chain. And of course, you'll be able to download this. It's absolutely free. Share it with whoever you like. Remember what I said, this is a starting point. This isn't a definitive snare drum effects chain, but I'm hoping that I've explained my reasons behind it so that you can you understand why I made the decisions. So in understanding why I made the decisions, you're going to be in a better place to change some of the things, or change the order of the plugins, or change the plugins, etc. It just puts you in a better place. But please remember, don't copy the numbers, because it's going to be different for every single snare drum. So thanks for watching. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.